The courtroom was completely still. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the air felt tight, like it was waiting for something to break. Brian sat upright at the defense table, shoulders squared, jaw set. His fingers were interlocked in front of him, steady on the surface. But the tension in his grip told a different story. Across from him, Anne sat quietly. One hand rested gently on her stomach. Her face showed no panic, no urgency, just a calm that didn't need explanation. The judge adjusted the document in front of him, eyes scanning the final lines. The soft rustle of paper echoed louder than it should have. Then he looked up. The DNA test has been reviewed. A pause, short but heavy. Brian leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment everything would finally make sense. Anne didn't move. The results confirm. The judge continued that the alleged father, another pause, is not a biological match. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, that's not possible. Brian's voice cut through the silence instantly, sharp, controlled, but just loud enough to carry across the room. A few heads turned. Someone in the back shifted in their seat. Brian shook his head, already rejecting what he had just heard. "No, that's wrong," he said, his voice firmer now. "There has to be a mistake." The judge didn't respond immediately. Anne remained still. She didn't look at Brian, didn't react to the words. Her eyes stayed forward, her expression unchanged. But there was something deeper behind it, something settled. Brian leaned forward further, frustration rising. "I requested this test myself," he continued. "There's no way. Mr. Brian." The judge's voice was calm, but it carried enough authority to stop him. Brian froze mid-sentence. The room fell quiet again. The judge glanced back down at the document briefly, then back up. "There is an additional finding attached to this report." That was the moment the energy in the room shifted. Not louder, just different. Brian frowned slightly, confusion replacing his certainty. "What additional finding?" he asked. The judge adjusted his glasses, taking a measured breath before continuing. "Due to certain inconsistencies in the sample provided," he said carefully, "the lab conducted a secondary verification process." Brian's expression tightened. "Inconsistencies?" he repeated. A faint murmur passed through the courtroom, subtle but noticeable. Anne finally blinked slowly, but still said nothing. The judge nodded once. "Yes." He looked directly at Brian. "And based on that verification," he paused, just long enough, "there is further information that must be acknowledged." Brian stared at him, waiting. The confidence he walked in with was still there, but now it had cracks. "What information?" he asked. The judge glanced down at the page one last time, then cut. A man dragged his pregnant wife into court to prove she had betrayed him, but what the DNA test revealed about him changed everything. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do, or stood in front of someone you trusted, only to realize they had already decided who you were without listening? Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about a child. It wasn't just about proof. It was about control, ego, and a truth that no one in that room was prepared for. Before we get into this, do me a quick favor. Like this video and comment "Truth matters," because stories like this, they need to be heard. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. To understand how it got this far, we have to go back. Not to the courtroom, not to the argument, but to a moment that felt simple at the time. A moment that didn't look like the beginning of something that would end in silence, doubt, and a legal battle. Texas had a way of making everything feel bigger than it really was. The houses stood wide and proud. The neighborhoods looked polished. The smiles people wore felt warm, inviting, like nothing complicated could exist behind them. And for Brian, that image mattered. At 38, Brian had built a life that looked exactly how he wanted it to look. Structured, predictable, respectable. He worked in corporate logistics for a mid-sized oil services company just outside Houston. It wasn't flashy work, but it was stable. And stability, to Brian, meant everything. He believed in order, in planning, in keeping things where they belonged, especially his reputation. Brian didn't grow up in chaos. He grew up in a quiet neighborhood where lawns were trimmed neatly. Conversations were measured, and people didn't involve themselves in anything that didn't concern them. His parents had been married for over 40 years. To him, that wasn't just love. It was proof that structure worked, that control worked, that when you kept things aligned, things lasted. So when Brian imagined his future, he didn't picture uncertainty. He pictured consistency, a home that looked right, a marriage that functioned right, a life that made sense. And then Anne entered it. She wasn't loud when he first noticed her. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention. That's what made her stand out. There was a calm confidence in the way she carried herself, the kind that didn't need validation, the kind that made people pay attention without asking for it. Brian noticed immediately, not because she fit into his world, but because she didn't. And that difference was exactly what drew him in. The room was louder than Brian preferred. Conversations overlapped. Glasses clinked. Laughter came in bursts that felt slightly forced. The kind of environment where everyone was trying just a little too hard to be noticed. Brian stood near one of the high tables, adjusting his cuff slightly as he scanned the space. He didn't enjoy events like this, but he understood their value. Connections, visibility, positioning. That's what mattered. He had already exchanged a few business cards, nodded through a handful of surface-level conversations, and mentally counted how much longer he needed to stay before it was acceptable to leave. Then he saw her, Anne. She wasn't moving around like everyone else. She wasn't trying to insert herself into conversations or impress anyone with exaggerated energy. She stood still, listening, observing. There was a small group around her, but she wasn't competing for attention. When she spoke, people naturally leaned in, not because she was loud, but because she was clear. That caught Brian off guard. He watched for a moment longer than he intended. Something about her didn't fit into the pattern he had already mapped out for the room, and that made her interesting. He picked up his drink, straightened slightly, and walked toward her. As he approached, he caught the tail end of her sentence. Because not everything that looks successful is actually sustainable. There was a brief pause in the group, then a few nods. Someone chuckled lightly. Brian stepped in just enough to be noticed. Not really your scene, is it? He said. Anne turned toward him. Her expression didn't change much. Just a slight lift of her eyebrow. A hint of curiosity. What makes you say that? She asked. Brian gave a small shrug. You don't look impressed. Anne held his gaze for a second. Then a soft smile appeared. I'm observing. One word. Simple. But it landed differently than anything else he had heard that night. Brian nodded slowly. Observing what exactly? Anne glanced around the room briefly before answering. People, she said. How they present themselves versus what they actually say when they get comfortable. Brian smirked slightly. And what have you concluded so far? Anne looked back at him. That most people don't realize how much they reveal when they're trying to impress. There was no judgment in her tone, just clarity. Brian let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost amused. That sounds like a dangerous skill. Anne shrugged lightly. Only if you're pretending to be something you're not. The group around them slowly shifted as others moved on to different conversations, leaving the two of them standing there. Brian noticed, but didn't mind. So, he said, are you always this analytical at events like this? Anne tilted her head slightly. Are you always this direct with people you just met? Brian didn't hesitate. Yes. That earned him a small, genuine laugh. Then I guess we're both being consistent, she said. There was a brief pause, not awkward, just steady. Brian studied her for a moment. There was something grounded about her. She wasn't trying to impress him, and she wasn't intimidated by him either. That balance was rare. So, what brings you here? He asked. Anne leaned lightly against the table beside her. A friend convinced me I needed to expand my circle, she said, making a small gesture with her finger. Brian nodded. Strategic networking, he said. That's what they call it. Anne smiled faintly. And you? Let me guess. You actually believe in it. Brian didn't deny it. I believe in structure. he said. And environments like this create opportunities. Anne considered that for a second. Opportunities for what? She asked. Growth, advancement, stability. Anne nodded slowly, repeating the last word under her breath. Stability. There was something in the way she said it that made Brian notice. You don't sound convinced, he said. Anne looked at him directly. I think stability is important, she said, but I also think people use it as a reason to avoid things they can't control. Brian's expression shifted slightly. That's one way to look at it. Anne didn't push. She simply held the space. And how do you look at it? She asked. Brian straightened slightly. I think if you build things the right way, he said, you don't have to worry about losing control. Anne didn't respond immediately. She studied his face for a brief second, like she was trying to understand not just what he said, but why he believed it. Then she nodded. That's interesting, she said. Brian raised an eyebrow. Interesting how? Anne smiled again, but this time there was a bit more behind it. Because life doesn't always ask for permission before it changes things. Brian let out a quiet chuckle. Maybe, he said, but most problems can be avoided with the right planning. Anne didn't argue. She just looked at him for a moment longer. You sound like someone who likes things to make sense, she said. Brian didn't hesitate. I do. Anne nodded. I respect that. Another pause. This one felt slightly different, not tense, just aware. Brian found himself asking a question he didn't usually ask. And you? He said. What do you like? Anne's answer came without hesitation. I like honesty, she said, even when it's uncomfortable. Brian held her gaze. Most people say that, he replied. Anne shook her head slightly. No, she said. Most people say they value honesty until it challenges them. That landed. Brian didn't respond right away, because for the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about networking. He wasn't thinking about strategy. He was thinking about her, the way she spoke, the way she didn't rush her words, the way she didn't try to win the conversation. She just stayed present in it. It was different, and that difference kept him there. So, Anne said after a moment, what's your name? Brian blinked slightly, almost forgetting they hadn't even exchanged that yet. Brian, he said. Anne nodded. Anne. He repeated it once, quietly. Anne, as if confirming it. There was something about the simplicity of that moment that neither of them acknowledged, but it lingered. Around them, the event continued. Voices rising and falling, people moving from one conversation to another. But for Brian, the room had narrowed. And for Anne, the night had become more interesting than she expected. Are you planning on staying long? Brian asked. Anne glanced around briefly. I was thinking about leaving soon, she admitted. Brian nodded slowly. I was thinking the same thing. Anne smiled. Then maybe this event served its purpose. Brian tilted his head slightly. And what purpose was that? Anne met his eyes. To have at least one real conversation. Brian let out a quiet laugh. Fair enough. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. Would you be open to continuing this conversation somewhere less crowded? Anne considered him, not quickly, not impulsively. She took her time, and that, more than anything, made Brian wait. Finally she nodded. Yeah, she said simply. And just like that, what started as an ordinary evening shifted into something neither of them fully understood yet, but something had already begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. What started as a simple conversation didn't stay simple for long. Brian wasn't used to being drawn in by someone so quickly. He usually moved with intention, measured steps, clear outcomes. But with Anne, things didn't follow his usual pace. And strangely, he didn't try to slow it down. Their second meeting wasn't planned weeks in advance. It happened 2 days later. Brian had suggested coffee. Anne agreed without hesitation. They met at a quiet spot just outside downtown Houston. Not crowded, not loud. Just enough movement to feel alive without being distracting. Brian arrived early. Of course he did. He chose a table with a clear view of the entrance. Checked his watch once. Then again. Then finally settled back in his seat. When Anne walked in, she didn't rush. She scanned the room once, spotted him, and walked over with the same calm presence she had the first night. Hey, she said. Hey, Brian replied, standing briefly before sitting back down. No awkwardness, no forced energy, just continuity. Their conversations didn't stay on the surface. They moved quickly into things that most people take time to share: childhood, family, beliefs, and spoke about growing up in Dallas, about being surrounded by people who expressed everything openly. Nothing was ever hidden, she said. If someone was happy, you knew. If something was wrong, you knew that too. Brian nodded, listening. That sounds intense, he said, and smiled slightly. It was honest. Then she looked at him. What about you? Brian leaned back slightly. My family was quieter, he said, structured. Respect was shown differently. Differently? How? Anne asked. Brian paused, choosing his words carefully. People didn't challenge each other much, he said. If something needed to be addressed, it was handled calmly, without unnecessary emotion. Anne tilted her head slightly. Unnecessary? She repeated. Brian nodded. I think emotions can complicate things that don't need to be complicated. Anne didn't argue. She just took that in. Or, she said gently, they can reveal things that logic alone won't. Brian held her gaze. That was the second time she said something that didn't match his worldview, but didn't feel wrong either. Just different. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into something more consistent. They started seeing each other regularly. Dinner after work, short drives with long conversations, moments that didn't need to be planned to feel meaningful. Brian liked how clear things felt with her. Anne liked how intentional he was. At first their differences felt like balance, like they filled in spaces the other didn't have. Then came the invitation. Come to Dallas with me this weekend, Anne said one evening. Brian looked at her. Dallas? Yeah, she said. Family cookout. Nothing formal. Just my people. Brian hesitated for a second. Not visibly, but internally. Family meant exposure. Exposure meant unpredictability. Still, he nodded. All right, he said. Anne smiled. You'll be fine. He wasn't prepared. Not fully. The moment they arrived, Brian realized this was nothing like what he was used to. Music filled the air. Not background noise, but something people actually moved to. Voices overlapped freely. Laughter came from different directions, not controlled or contained. People greeted Anne before she even made it fully into the yard. Anne, there she is. Look who finally showed up. She was pulled into hugs, quick conversations, familiar teasing. Brian stood just behind her for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't structured. This wasn't measured. This was alive. Anne turned back toward him, noticing the slight pause in his stance. You okay? She asked, handing him a drink. Brian nodded. Yeah, he said. Just different. Anne smiled. Different doesn't mean bad. That line stayed with him, not because it convinced him, but because it challenged something he hadn't questioned before. As the day went on, Brian observed more than he participated. He watched how people interacted, how conversations overlapped without conflict, how disagreements didn't turn into silence. They turned into discussion. At one point, a small debate broke out near the grill. Two relatives going back and forth about something neither seemed willing to drop. Brian expected tension. Instead, they both laughed midway through the conversation and kept talking like nothing had happened. He frowned slightly, trying to understand it. Anne noticed again. You're analyzing everything, aren't you? She said, stepping beside him. Brian didn't deny it. I'm trying to figure out how this works, he said. Anne took a sip of her drink. It's simple, she said. People say what they feel, and then they move forward. Brian shook his head slightly. That sounds messy. Anne smiled. We're honest. Later that evening, they sat off to the side for a moment, away from most of the noise. Brian leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It's a lot, he admitted. Anne nodded. I know. Brian glanced at her. You're comfortable in this, he said. Anne looked around briefly, then back at him. This is home, she said simply. There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, just certainty. Brian looked away for a moment, watching people move, talk, laugh without thinking twice about how they were being perceived. It didn't make sense to him, but it also didn't feel wrong, just unfamiliar. On the drive back to Houston, the car was quieter, not tense, just reflective. Brian kept his eyes on the road. Anne glanced at him occasionally, sensing he was still processing. She said eventually, "What did you think?" Brian took a moment before answering. "It's different," he said again. Anne smiled slightly. "You said that already." Brian nodded. "I know." A brief pause. Then, "I don't fully understand it," he admitted. Anne didn't react negatively. She just nodded. "That's okay," she said. Brian glanced at her briefly. "You don't mind?" he asked. Anne shook her head. "No," she said. "Understanding takes time." Then she added, "But it also takes openness." Brian didn't respond right away, because that word, openness, felt like something he hadn't fully committed to. That was the moment the balance between them started to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. Brian didn't just see Anne as different anymore. He started seeing parts of her life as things he couldn't shape, and that made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't fully acknowledge yet. At first he told himself it wasn't a problem, that differences were normal, that adjustment was part of any relationship. But deep down, something had already started forming. A question he didn't say out loud, a feeling he didn't fully confront. Because for Brian, things only worked when they made sense, and Anne didn't always fit into that structure. But he wasn't ready to walk away, not even close, because what he felt for her was real, even if he didn't fully understand it. And Anne? She believed something just as strongly. That love wasn't about being the same. It was about growing together. Neither of them realized yet that they weren't just building a relationship. They were building something that would eventually test everything they believed about trust, control, and truth. At first, the disagreements didn't feel serious. They didn't start with raised voices or sharp words. They started quietly. Small moments, short conversations that didn't quite land the way they were meant to. It happened one evening after dinner. They were sitting in Brian's living room, the space as organized as ever, everything in place, nothing out of line. Anne sat comfortably on the couch, one leg tucked under the other, scrolling through her phone before setting it aside. Brian stood near the kitchen counter, finishing a glass of water. "You left the lights on upstairs earlier," he said. Anne looked up. "Oh, yeah, I forgot. I'll get it." Brian nodded. A simple moment, nothing unusual. But then he added, "You've been doing that a lot lately." Anne paused slightly. "Doing what?" she asked. "Leaving things unfinished," Brian replied. His tone wasn't loud, not aggressive, just firm. Anne studied him for a second. "I didn't realize it was becoming a pattern," she said calmly. Brian placed the glass down. "I just think it's something you should be more aware of." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but not relaxed either. Anne nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and for a moment, that was it. But later that night, as they got ready for bed, Anne spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Brian glanced at her. "Sure." Anne leaned lightly against the dresser. "When you notice something like that, why don't you just say it in the moment, without making it sound like a bigger issue?" Brian frowned slightly. "I did say it in the moment." Anne shook her head gently. "No, you pointed it out, then added that I've been doing it a lot." Brian crossed his arms slightly. "Because it's true." Anne held his gaze. "I'm not saying it isn't," she replied. "I'm saying how you say things matters." Brian exhaled. "I wasn't trying to make it a big deal." Anne nodded. "But it felt like one." That was the first moment something shifted, not loudly, but clearly. Brian wasn't used to having his tone questioned. In his mind, he had simply stated a fact, direct, efficient, problem identified. But Anne wasn't responding to the problem. She was responding to the delivery. "I think you're overthinking it," Brian said. Anne didn't react immediately. She took a second. Then, "I think you're underestimating it," she replied. Brian's expression tightened slightly. "What does that mean?" Anne stepped a little closer, her voice still calm but more intentional now. "It means small things build up," she said. "And if we don't talk about how we communicate, it turns into something bigger later." Brian shook his head. "Not everything needs to be analyzed like that." Anne didn't back down. "It's not analysis," she said. "It's understanding." Brian let out a quiet breath, clearly losing patience. "Why does everything have to be a discussion?" he asked. There it was, the first real line drawn. Anne looked at him steadily. "Because that's how people understand each other," she said. Brian didn't respond. He turned slightly, reaching for something on the nightstand as if the conversation had already ended. But Anne didn't move. You don't see it that way? She asked. Brian shook his head. I think if something is obvious, it doesn't need to be talked about over and over, he said. Anne nodded slowly. And who decides what's obvious? That question sat between them. Brian didn't answer, because in his mind, he already knew the answer. The next disagreement came a few days later. This time, it wasn't about something small. It was about time. Anne had plans to visit her family that weekend. She mentioned it casually while they were having dinner. I'm thinking of going to Dallas on Saturday, she said. Brian looked up. This weekend? He asked. Yeah, Anne replied. I haven't seen them in a couple of weeks. Brian set his fork down. We already talked about organizing the house this weekend, he said. Anne nodded. We did. But I can go early and come back Sunday. Brian frowned. That doesn't make sense, he said. Why plan something and then change it last minute? Anne tilted her head slightly. It's not last minute, she said. I'm just adjusting. Brian shook his head again. That's not how I like to do things. Anne noticed the wording. Not we. First, so it has to be done your way? She asked. Brian sighed. I'm just saying we should stick to what we agreed on. Anne leaned back slightly. And I'm saying plans can change, she replied. The tension was no longer subtle. It was present, clear, and growing. Brian leaned forward slightly. It's about consistency, Anne, he said. If we keep changing things, nothing gets done properly. Anne met his gaze. It's about balance, Brian, she said. Life doesn't always follow a fixed schedule. Brian didn't respond immediately, because, once again, they weren't just disagreeing. They were operating from completely different beliefs. This time, neither of them backed down quickly. The conversation stretched longer than it needed to. Not loud, not explosive, but firm. Eventually, Anne stood up. I'm still going, she said calmly. Brian looked at her. Even after we talked about this? Anne nodded. Yes. A pause. Then she added, I'm not canceling on my family to keep a plan that can be moved. Brian leaned back in his chair, uncomfortable, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't. That night felt different, not broken, but no longer easy. For Brian, something had shifted, not in a way he could explain clearly, but in a way he could feel. Anne wasn't aligning the way he expected. She wasn't adjusting the way he believed she should, and that started to bother him more than he admitted. For Anne, something became clearer. Brian didn't just like structure. He expected it, and not just for himself, for everything around him. They didn't talk about it again that night, but the silence between them carried more weight than their words, and that was how it started. Not with a major argument, not with something obvious, but with small moments that refused to resolve the same way. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up quietly, in the way Brian started noticing things more, and not just noticing, correcting. At first it sounded harmless, small comments, short observations, things that, on their own, didn't seem worth questioning. One evening they were getting ready to go out for dinner with a few of Brian's colleagues. Anne stood near the mirror, adjusting her outfit. Brian walked past, glancing briefly. Then he stopped. You're wearing that? He asked. Anne turned slightly, looking at him through the mirror. Yeah, she said. Why? Brian hesitated for a second, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was deciding how to say it. I just think something a little more reserved would fit the setting better, he said. Anne's expression didn't change immediately. She turned fully toward him. Reserved? She repeated. Brian nodded. It's a work environment, he added. First impressions matter. Anne looked down briefly at what she was wearing, then back at him. I like this, she said simply. Brian gave a small nod. I'm not saying it's bad, he replied. I'm just saying it might not be the best choice for tonight. There was a pause. Anne held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then, okay, she said, and turned back to the mirror. They still went to dinner. Anne didn't change. Brian didn't mention it again, but something had already settled between them. Not resolved, just noted. At the restaurant, Brian was in his element, confident, measured, speaking with ease about work, projects, timelines. Anne sat beside him, listening, occasionally adding to the conversation when it felt natural. At one point, someone asked her a question about her background. She answered openly, her voice relaxed, her tone warm. "And honestly," she said, smiling slightly, "I think where you come from shapes how you see everything." One of Brian's colleagues nodded. "That makes sense," they said. Anne continued, "You can't separate people from their experiences. It shows up in how they communicate, how they connect." Brian placed his hand lightly on the table, a small gesture, but enough to interrupt the rhythm. "I think what Anne is trying to say," he said smoothly, "is that environment influences behavior." Anne paused, not because she didn't understand what he said, but because she didn't need it to be translated. She turned her head slightly toward him. "I was already saying that," she said. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it was clear. Brian smiled lightly. "Just simplifying it," he replied. The conversation moved on, but Anne didn't forget that moment. Later, as they walked back to the car, the night air quieter than the restaurant, Anne spoke. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Brian glanced at her. "Do what?" Anne stopped walking. "You interrupted me," she said. Brian frowned slightly. "I wasn't interrupting," he replied. "I was helping clarify your point." Anne shook her head. "I didn't ask for clarification." Brian exhaled. "It wasn't a big deal, Anne." Anne held his gaze. "It was to me." There was a pause, the kind that doesn't pass quickly. Brian opened the car door. "Let's not turn this into something unnecessary," he said. Anne didn't move immediately. "See, that's the problem," she replied. Brian looked at her. "You decide what matters and what doesn't," she continued, "without asking how I feel about it." Brian leaned slightly against the car. "I'm trying to make things smoother," he said. "That's all." Anne let out a quiet breath. "But it doesn't feel smooth to me," she said. They got into the car. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't resolved. As Brian drove, he kept his eyes on the road. "I think you're reading too much into it," he said after a moment. Anne looked out the window briefly before responding. "I think you're not reading into it enough," she replied. Brian tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. "It was one comment," he said. "It wasn't just one," Anne said. That made him glance at her. "What do you mean?" Anne turned toward him. "This keeps happening," she said. "The way I speak, the way I act, the way I present myself. You keep adjusting it." Brian shook his head. "I'm not adjusting you," he said. "I'm just pointing out things that could be better." There it was, clear, direct, and this time it landed differently. Anne went quiet for a second, not because she didn't have a response, but because she was deciding how to say it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I don't need to be improved, Brian." The words stayed in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Brian frowned. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. Anne didn't raise her voice, but she didn't soften it either. "It is," she said. Brian shook his head again. "You're taking it the wrong way." Anne let out a small breath. "No," she said. "I'm taking it the way it feels." The car slowed slightly as Brian approached a light. He stared ahead, jaw tightening. "I'm trying to help you," he said. Anne looked at him. "And I'm trying to be accepted as I am," she replied. The light turned green. Brian drove forward, but neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Brian said, quieter this time, "I just want you to represent yourself well." Anne didn't respond immediately. Then she asked, "To who?" Brian hesitated. "To people that matter," he said. Anne nodded slowly. "And who decides that?" she asked. Brian didn't answer, because once again, they weren't talking about the same thing. By the time they got home, the distance between them wasn't physical. It was emotional, and it was growing. That night, they didn't argue further, but they didn't resolve anything either. Brian believed he was guiding. Anne felt she was being corrected. Brian believed he was helping. Anne felt she was being reshaped. And the most dangerous part of it all was that Brian didn't see the damage yet. To him, everything still made sense. But to Anne, something no longer did. After that night in the car, things didn't fall apart. They also didn't fully come back together. They settled, not in a way that fixed anything, but in a way that allowed both of them to move forward without reopening the conversation. Brian became quieter about his corrections, not because he had changed his perspective, but because he believed the issue had already been addressed. In his mind, there was no need to revisit it. He adjusted his approach, less direct, more subtle, but the intention remained the same. Anne noticed. She noticed the pauses before he spoke, the slight hesitations, the moments where he chose not to say something, but still clearly thought it, and somehow that felt heavier, because now it wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say. Still, they continued. Dinner plans, weekend routines, phone calls during the day. On the surface, everything looked stable. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong, and that's what made it easier to move forward. It happened a few weeks later, not during an argument, not during a deep conversation, but during a quiet evening. They were sitting together, the room calm. The atmosphere relaxed in a way that hadn't been felt in a while. Anne was scrolling through something on her phone. Brian was watching her, not casually, not distracted, focused. Anne. She looked up. Yeah? Brian shifted slightly in his seat. I've been thinking, he said. Anne smiled faintly. That usually leads somewhere, she replied. Brian didn't smile back, not because he was serious, but because he was certain. I want to build something with you, he said. Anne's expression softened slightly. We already are, she said. Brian shook his head once. I mean, long-term, he clarified. Anne studied him now, fully attentive. Brian reached into his pocket, slow, intentional, and when he brought his hand back out, there was no hesitation. Anne's eyes dropped briefly, then lifted again. I don't believe in wasting time, Brian said. His voice was steady, measured. I believe in commitment, in structure, in knowing where things are going. Anne didn't interrupt. She listened. I see that with you, he continued. I see something that can last. There was a pause, not because he didn't have more to say, but because he didn't feel like he needed to say more. And then, marry me. The words didn't come with a dramatic build-up. They didn't need one. Anne didn't answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood what the question meant beyond the moment. She looked at him, really looked, not just at what he was offering, but at who he was. Everything she had seen so far, everything she had felt, the good, the tension, the differences, the moments that didn't fully sit right. And then she smiled, soft, real. Yes, she said. Brian nodded once, as if confirming a decision that had already been made in his mind long before he asked. He placed the ring in her hand, not rushed, not overly emotional, just certain. Anne looked down at it briefly, then back at him. In that moment, it felt like they had chosen each other, but what neither of them said out loud was that they hadn't fully resolved what stood between them. They had simply decided to move forward anyway. The wedding came together quickly. Brian handled logistics. Anne handled connection. The venue reflected both of them. Clean, organized, but filled with energy, music, and life. Brian's side was composed, measured conversations, polite smiles, controlled interactions. Anne's side was expressive, laughter that carried, voices overlapping, people moving freely, without holding back. For a moment, it worked. The ceremony itself was beautiful, simple, direct, focused. When Brian looked at Anne as she stood across from him, he saw exactly what he believed in, a future that made sense, a commitment that had structure, something he could rely on. When Anne looked at Brian, she saw something she believed she could grow with, a man who was steady, focused, intentional. They exchanged vows, words that promised unity, partnership, understanding, and for that moment, it felt true. The reception carried that same energy. Music, movement, celebration. Brian stood slightly outside his comfort zone, but he stayed present. He adapted, watched, engaged where he could. Anne moved freely through it all, laughing, talking, pulling him into moments he wouldn't have stepped into on his own. At one point, she grabbed his hand. Come on, she said. Brian hesitated for half a second, then followed. It wasn't natural for him, but he did it anyway, because in that moment, he believed that was what partnership looked like. And for Anne, that moment meant something else. It meant he was willing, even if it didn't come easily. That night ended with smiles, with pictures, with people saying things like, You two balance each other. And from the outside, it looked exactly like that. Balanced, but balance isn't always stability, because what looks, even on the surface, can still carry tension underneath. After the wedding, life settled into something more structured, more defined. Brian took on responsibility naturally. Finances, schedules, decisions, not in a controlling way. At least, not in his mind. In his mind, he was leading, providing direction, creating stability. Anne adjusted. At first, she let things move, let him take initiative, believing that over time, they would find a rhythm that worked for both of them. But slowly, that rhythm began to feel one-sided. Conversations became shorter, decisions became quicker, and Anne began noticing something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. She wasn't being included, not fully. One evening, she stood in the kitchen, watching Brian go through something on his laptop. "You didn't tell me about that," she said. Brian glanced up briefly. "About what?" Anne gestured toward the screen. "That decision," she said. Brian shrugged slightly. "It was straightforward," he replied. "I handled it." Anne stared at him for a moment. "Without asking me?" Brian closed the laptop halfway. "I made the call that made the most sense," he said. Anne took a slow breath. "That's not how this works," she said. Brian frowned. "What do you mean?" Anne stepped closer. "It means we're supposed to decide things together," she said. Brian shook his head slightly. "Everything doesn't need to be a joint discussion," he replied. Anne held his gaze. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." That moment didn't explode, but it didn't fade either, because now the pattern was becoming clearer. Brian wasn't trying to control her, not intentionally, but he was shaping the environment around them, making decisions, setting direction, expecting alignment. And Anne was beginning to feel it, not as support, but as limitation. And the hardest part was that Brian still believed everything was working, because in his world, structure meant success. But in theirs, it was starting to create distance. Marriage didn't fix what stood between them. It didn't resolve the tension. It didn't bridge the difference. Yet after the wedding, everything became more defined. Not gradually, not subtly. Clearly, Brian stepped into the role he believed he was meant to take. Provider, planner, decision maker. At first, it didn't feel out of place. It looked responsible, organized, efficient. Bills were handled on time. Schedules were structured. Plans were set ahead. From the outside, it looked like stability, but inside the home, something began to change. It started with finances. One evening, Anne sat at the table going through a few documents. Brian walked in, placing his keys down, loosening his watch slightly. "I took care of the account adjustments," he said. Anne looked up. "What adjustments?" she asked. Brian pulled out a chair and sat down. "I moved some funds around," he replied. "It made more sense to consolidate everything." Anne blinked once. "You moved money?" she asked. Brian nodded. "Yeah. It's more efficient this way." Anne stared at him for a second. "And you didn't think to tell me before doing that?" Brian leaned back slightly. "It didn't require a discussion," he said. "It was a straightforward decision." That word again, decision. Anne placed the papers down slowly. "Brian, that's not how this works," she said. Brian frowned. "What do you mean?" Anne sat up straighter. "It means we're supposed to make financial decisions together," she said. Brian shook his head once. "Not every decision needs two people involved," he replied. Anne held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "It does." Brian let out a quiet breath. "I'm handling it," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." That was the moment something shifted deeper. Anne didn't look relieved. She didn't look reassured. She looked dismissed. "I wasn't worried," she said calmly. "I was included." Brian didn't respond immediately, because to him, those two things meant the same thing. But to Anne, they didn't. Days passed, and the pattern continued. It wasn't just finances. It was decisions. Small at first, then bigger. What groceries were bought? What plans were made? What weekends were scheduled? Each time, Brian acted first, explained after. Not aggressively, not harshly, but consistently. One afternoon, Anne walked into the living room and noticed something new. A piece of furniture had been replaced. She stopped, looked at it, then looked at Brian. "You changed this?" she asked. Brian glanced up from his laptop. Yeah, he said. The other one didn't fit the space properly. Anne took a few steps closer. When did you decide that? She asked. Brian shrugged slightly. I've been thinking about it for a while. Anne folded her arms lightly. And you didn't think to ask me? Brian closed the laptop halfway. It was a practical decision, he said. Anne stared at him, not reacting immediately. Then, that's not the point, she said. Brian frowned. What is the point, then? Anne took a breath. The point is this is our home, she said, not just yours. Brian leaned back in his chair. I'm making improvements, he replied. Anne shook her head slowly. No, she said. You're making choices without me. There was a pause. Brian didn't raise his voice, but his tone changed. I'm trying to keep things running smoothly, he said. Anne stepped closer. And I'm trying to feel like I actually live here, she replied. That landed, but not in the way she hoped. Brian sat there for a moment. Then, I think you're turning this into something bigger than it is, he said. Anne exhaled slowly. No, she said. I think you're making it smaller than it is. Silence. The kind that doesn't resolve anything. Later that evening, the tension didn't fade. It stayed, not loud, but present. Anne sat on the couch, her posture relaxed, but her expression thoughtful. Brian stood near the window, looking out briefly before turning back. We're not on the same page, Anne said. Brian nodded slightly. Because you keep questioning things that don't need to be questioned, he replied. Anne looked at him. No, she said. Because you keep deciding things that affect both of us. Without me, Brian crossed his arms. I'm making decisions that are best for us, he said. Anne's eyes didn't leave his. That's not a partnership. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Brian didn't respond right away, because, for the first time, he heard it, not as disagreement, but as accusation. He shook his head slightly. I don't see it that way, he said. Anne nodded. I know, she replied, and that was the problem. They weren't just disagreeing anymore. They were living two different experiences inside the same marriage. For Brian, everything was functioning. For Anne, something was missing. Not attention, not presence, but inclusion. And without it, everything else started to feel controlled, not guided, not supported, managed. And the more that feeling grew, the harder it became to ignore. Because love wasn't supposed to feel like permission, magnified it. After that conversation, nothing was fully resolved. But something had been said that couldn't be taken back. That's not a partnership. The words didn't fade. They settled in the way Brian moved, in the way Anne watched him. The house didn't feel tense every moment, but it no longer felt easy. They continued their routines, woke up, went to work, came back, spoke when necessary. But something had changed beneath all of that. Anne felt it most when things were quiet, not when they were talking, but when they weren't. Because silence between two people can mean many things: peace, comfort, or distance. And this wasn't peace. A few weeks later, Anne sat alone in a small clinic room. The space was calm, still. She stared at the paper in her hand, reading it once, then again. Her fingers tightened slightly around it, not out of fear, but out of realization. She took a breath, slow, steady, then placed her hand gently on her stomach. The drive back felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because of what she was carrying now, not just physically, but emotionally. When she walked into the house, Brian was already there, sitting at the table, laptop open, focused. He glanced up briefly. You're back, he said. Anne nodded. Yeah. She stood there for a moment, not moving forward immediately. Brian noticed. What is it? He asked. Anne walked toward him slowly, then stopped across the table. I went to the doctor today, she said. Brian straightened slightly. Everything okay? He asked. Anne nodded once. Then, I'm pregnant. The words landed, clear, direct. Brian didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't hear her, but because his mind was processing something else. Anne watched him, waiting. Seconds passed. Then Brian leaned back slightly in his chair, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just quiet. You're sure? He asked. Anne nodded. Yes. Another pause. Brian ran his hand lightly across his jaw, looking away briefly. I just didn't expect it right now, he said. Anne studied him carefully. You're not happy? She asked. Brian looked back at her quickly. No, I didn't say that, he replied, but his tone didn't match his words. Anne didn't push immediately. She took a step closer. This is good, Brian, she said. Brian nodded once. Yeah, he said, but there was no warmth behind it, no excitement, no shift in energy, just acknowledgement. Anne felt it immediately, because this wasn't how she imagined this moment. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but at least present. Instead, it felt distant. Brian closed his laptop slowly. We'll need to plan, he said. Anne blinked slightly. Plan? She repeated. Brian nodded. Finances. Adjustments. Timing, he said. Anne looked at him, not upset, but searching. This isn't just something to plan, she said softly. Brian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Anne placed her hand lightly on her stomach again. This is something to feel, she said. Brian didn't respond, because in his mind, feeling didn't come first. Structure did. And already, he was thinking ahead. What needed to change? What needed to be controlled? What needed to be prepared? Anne saw it clearly. And for the first time, the distance between them didn't feel subtle. It felt real. Over the next few days, that distance grew, not through arguments, but through absence. Brian started working later, staying out longer, coming home quieter. When he was there, he was present physically, but not emotionally. Anne noticed everything. The shorter responses, the lack of eye contact, the way conversations didn't continue. One evening she sat beside him on the couch. We need to talk, she said. Brian didn't look away from what he was doing. About what? He asked. Anne turned toward him fully. About us, she said. That made him pause. He set his phone down slowly. What about us? He asked. Anne took a breath. You've changed, she said. Brian leaned back slightly. I'm just thinking, he replied. Anne frowned. About what? She asked. Brian hesitated. Then everything. That answer didn't help. It created more distance. Anne looked at him. This should be something good, she said. Brian nodded. I know, he replied. But again, his tone didn't carry it. Anne felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not confusion, but something heavier, loneliness. Because it's possible to sit right next to someone and still feel completely alone. And that's what this started to feel like. She placed her hand on her stomach again, not just as a gesture, but as grounding, because now it wasn't just about her, and she needed stability, not control, not silence, but support. And Brian wasn't giving it, not intentionally, but clearly. Days turned into a routine of distance. Brian stayed occupied. Anne stayed observant. Neither of them said what was really happening, but both of them felt it, because when something shifts emotionally, you don't need words to confirm it. You feel it, and the more Anne felt it, the clearer one thing became. Brian wasn't just distant. He was thinking, and whatever he was thinking, he wasn't sharing. And that silence was about to turn into something much bigger. By the time the tension finally surfaced, it had already been building for weeks, not through shouting, not through constant arguments, through silence, through distance, through thoughts that were never shared. Brian didn't arrive at the accusation suddenly. He arrived at it slowly, quietly. At first, it was just a thought, a question that passed through his mind and left just as quickly. Then it came back. The timing, the distance between them, the arguments they had been having. None of it proved anything. But to Brian, it didn't need to, because when control starts slipping, the mind looks for something to hold on to, and doubt is easy to hold on to. The argument started like any other, small, unremarkable. Anne stood in the kitchen, preparing something simple. Brian walked in, placing his phone down on the counter. You didn't tell me you had another appointment today, he said. Anne didn't look up immediately. I mentioned it earlier this week, she replied. Brian shook his head. You didn't say what it was for, he said. Anne turned slightly. It was just a checkup, she said. Brian frowned. You've had a lot of those lately, he said, and paused, then turned fully toward him. I'm pregnant, Brian, she said calmly. Brian nodded once. I'm aware, he replied, but his tone didn't match the words. Anne studied him. What is that supposed to mean? She asked. Brian crossed his arms. It means I'm paying attention, he said. Anne's expression tightened slightly. To what? She asked. Brian hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough, because once doubt forms, It doesn't stay quiet forever. How do I even know that child is mine? The words landed without warning. No build-up, no hesitation. Just said. The room went still. Anne didn't move, didn't react immediately. She blinked once, slowly. "What did you just say?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud. It was controlled, but heavy. Brian didn't step back. "I'm asking a question," he said. Anne stared at him. "No," she replied. "You're making an accusation." Brian shook his head. "I didn't accuse you of anything," he said. Anne took a step closer. "You just questioned the paternity of our child," she said. Brian held his ground. "I think we should do a DNA test," he said. There it was, clear, direct, and impossible to ignore. Anne didn't raise her voice, didn't react the way most people would expect. She didn't shout, didn't argue. She just stood there, looking at him, trying to understand what she was hearing. "You don't trust me?" she asked. Brian didn't answer. Not immediately, and that silence said everything. Anne nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in realization. "Okay," she said quietly. Brian blinked. He didn't expect that. "You're okay with that?" he asked. Anne stepped back slightly. "I have nothing to hide," she said. Her voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now, something final. She looked directly at him. "But understand this." Brian didn't move, didn't speak. "You're not just testing the baby," she said. A pause. Then, "You're testing this marriage." The words hit harder than anything else in that moment, because they weren't emotional. They were true. Brian looked at her. For a brief second, something shifted in his expression. Not doubt, not regret, but awareness. Still, he didn't take it back. "I need certainty," he said. Anne nodded once. "And I needed trust," she replied. Silence filled the space again, but this time, it didn't feel like distance. It felt like a line had been drawn. Anne turned away slowly, not rushing, not reacting emotionally, just stepping out of the moment. Because there was nothing left to argue. When someone decides to doubt you, no explanation feels necessary anymore. Brian stood there, still, confident in what he had asked, certain in what he believed he needed. But what he didn't realize was that something had already broken, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. That night they barely spoke, not because they didn't have words, but because the words that mattered had already been said. Anne lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting on her stomach, not thinking about the test, not thinking about proving anything, but thinking about one thing: how quickly trust can disappear when it was never fully understood. In the other room, Brian sat alone, not questioning what he had done, but preparing for what came next, because in his mind, this wasn't emotional. It was logical, a step toward clarity. But in reality, it was the moment everything changed, and neither of them would be the same after it. After the accusation, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. No shouting, no doors slammed, but everything changed. They moved around each other carefully, not out of respect, but out of distance. Mornings became quiet. Brian would get ready first, structured, efficient, leaving the room without saying much. Anne would wake up later, slower, not because she lacked energy, but because there was nothing waiting for her in that silence. Breakfast wasn't shared anymore. If they crossed paths, the conversations were short, practical, necessary. "Did you check the mail? It's on the counter. Are you going out today?" "Yes." No follow-up, no connection. It wasn't anger. It was absence, and absence can feel heavier than conflict. Brian adjusted quickly, at least on the surface. To him, this was a phase, a situation that required clarity, and clarity, in his mind, required structure. So he turned to what he understood best: control. It started with notes, small at first, things he kept to himself, dates, appointments, times Anne left the house, times she returned, not because he had proof of anything, but because he believed patterns revealed truth, and if something didn't make sense, he would make it make sense. One evening, Anne walked into the living room and noticed something on the table, a notebook. She didn't open it immediately, but something about the way it was placed. Intentional, visible. She picked it up slowly, flipped one page, then another. Her eyes moved across the lines. Short entries, clear, precise, no emotion, just information. She closed it gently. Not angry, not surprised, just certain. When Brian walked in later that evening, She didn't confront him immediately. She waited, watched him move around the space, calm, focused, like nothing was out of place. Finally, "Why are you writing things down?" she asked. Brian looked at her. "What things?" he replied. Anne placed the notebook on the table. "This," she said. Brian glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "I'm keeping track of details," he said. Anne nodded once. "For what?" she asked. Brian didn't hesitate. "For clarity." Anne held his gaze. "And what exactly are you trying to clarify?" she asked. Brian stepped closer. "I just want everything to make sense," he said. Anne studied him for a moment. "Then you don't trust me," she said. Brian didn't respond directly. "I trust facts," he replied. That was enough. Anne didn't argue, didn't defend herself, because she understood something now. This wasn't about proof anymore. This was about belief, and Brian had already chosen his. The next morning, Anne packed a small bag, not in a rush, not in anger, just with intention. Brian noticed as he walked past the bedroom. "You going somewhere?" he asked. Anne zipped the bag. "I'm going to Dallas," she said. Brian nodded slightly. "For how long?" he asked. Anne looked at him. "I don't know yet," she replied. Brian didn't stop her, didn't question it further, because in his mind, this didn't change anything. He believed everything would be resolved soon, that the test would give him answers, and once he had those answers, things would return to normal. But Anne was no longer thinking about returning. Dallas felt different the moment she arrived, not because anything had changed there, but because she had. The air felt lighter. The sounds felt familiar. Voices carried warmth. Laughter didn't feel forced. She stepped into the house and was immediately surrounded. Questions, care, presence. No one asked for explanations right away. They didn't need to, because sometimes people can see what you're going through without you saying it. Anne sat down later that evening, a plate of food in front of her. For the first time in a while, she exhaled fully. "You don't deserve to be dealing with this right now," she said quietly. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just releasing the thought. She placed her hand on her stomach again, not out of habit, but as a reminder of what mattered now. "Back in Houston," Brian continued as usual. Work, routine, structure, but something was different. The house was quieter, not just physically, but emotionally. Anne's absence wasn't loud, but it was noticeable, and for the first time, Brian felt something he didn't expect. Not doubt, but discomfort, because control feels different when there's no one left to control. And without realizing it, things had already moved beyond repair, not legally, not officially, but emotionally. Because once trust is replaced with suspicion, what remains is not the same relationship anymore. Distance didn't change Brian's direction. It reinforced it. With Anne in Dallas and the house quieter than before, Brian leaned deeper into what he believed was necessary. Not reflection, not reconsideration, action. To him, the situation had already crossed a line. The doubt he felt wasn't something he intended to sit with. It was something he planned to resolve. And resolution, in his world, didn't come from conversation anymore. It came from process. He sat at his desk one evening, documents spread neatly in front of him, everything aligned, everything organized, the same way he approached work. The same way he approached decisions. There was no hesitation. He filled out the request, carefully, deliberately. Every detail entered with precision. Names, dates, relevant information. When he finished, he reviewed it once, then again. Not because he doubted it, but because he believed in getting things right the first time. Then he signed it. That moment didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel heavy. To Brian, it felt necessary. He didn't call Anne before submitting it. He didn't warn her, because in his mind, this wasn't something that required permission. It required execution. Days later, Anne received the notice. She was sitting in Dallas when it arrived. The envelope looked official, structured, clear. She opened it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page, once, then again, not because she didn't understand it, but because she couldn't believe how far it had gone. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This wasn't a private disagreement. This was legal, public, formal. Brian hadn't just questioned her. He had taken that question and placed it in front of a system designed to confirm or deny it. Anne folded the paper carefully, not in frustration, not in anger, but with a quiet understanding. He had already made his decision. She didn't wait. That same day, she drove back to Houston. The road felt long, not because of distance, but because of what she was returning to. When she walked into the house, Brian was exactly where she expected him to be, at the table, documents in front of him, focused, like this was just another task. Anne stepped inside, closed the door behind her. Brian looked up. "You're back," he said. Anne didn't respond immediately. She walked toward him slowly, then placed the papers in front of him. "You filed this?" she asked. Brian glanced down briefly, then back up. "Yes," he said. No hesitation, no explanation, just confirmation. Anne nodded once. "You couldn't talk to me first?" she asked. Brian leaned back slightly. "We've already talked," he replied. Anne shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "You decided." Brian's expression tightened slightly. "There's a difference," she added. The room went quiet. Brian studied her for a moment. "I need proof," he said. Anne held his gaze. "And what happens after that?" she asked. Brian answered quickly. "If the child is mine, we move forward." Anne didn't react immediately. She took a breath. "And if it is?" she asked again. Brian hesitated, just briefly. "Then things go back to normal," he said. Anne almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it didn't make sense. "Normal?" she repeated softly. Brian didn't respond, because even he couldn't define what that meant anymore. Anne stepped back slightly. "You think this has a reset button?" she asked. Brian remained silent, and that silence answered more than anything he could have said. Anne looked at him, not with anger, not with frustration, but with clarity. "You didn't just question me," she said. "You made a decision about me." Brian frowned. "I made a decision based on what I see," he replied. Anne shook her head. "No," she said. "You made a decision based on what you believe." That difference mattered, because belief doesn't need evidence. And Brian was already convinced. He leaned forward slightly. "This process will settle everything," he said. Anne nodded slowly. "Yes," she replied. "It will." But her tone didn't carry agreement. It carried something else. Acceptance, not of his decision, but of what it meant. Because at that point, this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about understanding what was already lost. Brian looked at her, waiting, maybe for resistance, maybe for emotion. But Anne didn't give him either. She simply stood there, calm, grounded, unshaken. And that unsettled him more than any argument would have. "Why aren't you reacting?" he asked. Anne looked at him. "Because there's nothing left to argue," she said. Brian frowned. "There is," he replied. Anne shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You've already chosen your direction." Another silence, this one heavier than before. Brian leaned back. "This is about clarity," he said again. Anne nodded once. "No," she replied quietly. "This is about control." The words stayed in the air. Brian didn't respond, because for the first time, he didn't have a structured answer. Anne turned away, slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward. Because she understood something now that she hadn't fully accepted before. You can't convince someone who has already decided not to believe you. And Brian had already decided. What neither of them said out loud was that this step, this legal step, had changed everything. Not later, not after the results, right then. Because once something becomes public, it stops being just between two people. And from that moment forward, their relationship wasn't just strained, it was being tested in a way that couldn't be undone. Once the process became legal, everything started moving faster. Dates were set, documents were reviewed, steps were outlined clearly. What had once been a private issue between Brian and Anne was now structured within a system that didn't consider emotion, only facts. Brian adapted quickly. This was familiar territory for him. Clear procedures, defined timelines, expected outcomes. He followed every step with precision, showed up early, reviewed everything twice, asked the right questions. From the outside, he looked composed, prepared, certain. But beneath that certainty, something else had started to surface. Pressure, not from Anne, not from the process itself, but from perception. Because once something becomes formal, people start noticing. At work, the questions didn't come directly. They came carefully, subtle. You good? Everything all right at home? Brian responded the same way every time, just handling some personal matters. Short, controlled, but even that felt different because now it wasn't just about what he believed. It was about how he was being seen, and that mattered to him more than he admitted. Meanwhile, Anne approached things differently. She didn't try to control the situation. She didn't try to explain it to everyone. She didn't defend herself in conversations that didn't require her presence. Instead, she became quieter, not withdrawn, focused. Back in Dallas, she spent more time surrounded by familiarity, not to escape what was happening, but to stay grounded through it. She sat outside one evening, the air still, her posture relaxed, but her mind clear. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, not out of worry, but out of connection, because now her focus wasn't on Brian's doubts. It was on what she needed to protect. I used to think love meant staying no matter what, she said quietly. She wasn't speaking loudly, just enough for the words to exist outside her thoughts. She paused, then continued. Now, I think it also means knowing when someone stops choosing you. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, and clarity doesn't need to be loud. She still showed up for every required step, every appointment, every legal instruction, not to prove anything, but because she had nothing to hide, and that confidence showed, not in words, but in presence. As the court date approached, the tension didn't spike suddenly. It built steadily, like something inevitable. Brian prepared like he always did, clothes ready, documents organized, timeline understood. To him, this was the final step. The moment everything would be confirmed. The moment uncertainty would be removed. But certainty can feel very different depending on what you're expecting. The day arrived without announcement. No dramatic lead-up. No sudden change in atmosphere. Just time moving forward. Brian arrived early. Of course he did. Dressed sharply, posture straight. Everything about him reflected control. Even his expression, calm, focused. But his hands, resting lightly together, carried tension. Not visible to everyone, but present. He took his seat, looked around briefly, not searching for anyone, just observing, understanding the space. Then Anne walked in, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. Her presence didn't demand attention, but it held it. She moved with quiet confidence, sat down, placed one hand gently on her stomach, and remained still. Brian glanced at her for a brief moment, then looked forward again, because there was nothing left to say. Not here. The room wasn't full, but it didn't need to be. The weight of the moment was enough. Papers were arranged. Voices remained low. Movements were minimal. Everything felt contained, controlled, but beneath that control was something neither of them could change. The outcome? Anne sat without shifting, her breathing steady, her expression calm, not because she wasn't affected, but because she had already accepted something important. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to stand. Brian sat upright, focused, certain, because, in his mind, this was the moment everything would align with what he believed. The judge entered. Everyone rose briefly, then sat again. The process began, formal, measured, each step following the next, without delay. Anne didn't look at Brian. Brian didn't look at Anne, because whatever connection they once had was no longer part of this moment. Everything now was about the result, and as the final document was prepared, as the last step approached, the room grew quieter, not forced, natural, because everyone present understood. Something was about to be revealed, and once it was, nothing would remain the same. The room held its breath without meaning to. No one spoke. No one adjusted in their seat. Even the smallest movement seemed too loud for the moment that had arrived. Brian sat upright, shoulders squared, hands held together with controlled stillness. He had spent days preparing for this, reviewing every detail, replaying every question in his mind, telling himself that whatever happened, he would finally have certainty. Across from him, Anne remained composed. One hand rested gently on her stomach. Her face gave nothing away. She did not look defensive. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had already passed through the storm and was no longer interested in fighting the wind. The judge adjusted the papers in front of him and lowered his eyes to the report. The sound was small, a page shifting, a fingertip against paper. But in that silence it felt magnified. Brian leaned forward, almost without realizing it. This was the moment. Everything that had built from tension, suspicion, distance, legal filings, silence, and public scrutiny was now compressed into a few words on a page. The judge read quietly for a second longer. Then he looked up. "The DNA test has been reviewed." His voice was steady, formal, controlled. Brian's jaw tightened slightly. Anne did not move. The judge glanced down once more, as though making sure every line had been fully confirmed before speaking again. Then he continued, "The results confirm that the child is biologically related to the mother." A brief pause followed. Brian's eyes remained fixed on him. He was waiting for the next line, the line that mattered most to him, the line that he had been building toward since the first moment doubt entered his mind. The judge continued, "However, the alleged father is not a biological match." The words landed hard. They did not echo in the room, but they echoed in Brian's body. He blinked once, then again, like his mind had heard the sentence, but his certainty had not yet agreed to receive it. "That's not possible." His voice came out fast, sharper than he intended. A few heads shifted in the room. Brian looked from the judge to the document, then back again. "No," he said, firmer this time. "That's wrong. There has to be a mistake." Anne remained still. She did not turn toward him. She did not react to his disbelief. She simply sat in the same calm posture she had carried into the room, as if she had already accepted that this moment would say more about Brian than it ever would about her. The judge did not challenge Brian's tone. He simply watched him for a moment, with measured patience. "Mr. Brian," he said, "the report is clear." Brian shook his head. "I requested this test myself," he said. "The sample was submitted. The process was followed. So if that result says I'm not the father, then that confirms exactly what I've been saying." There it was. The first opening in his reaction. The first sign that shock had already started shifting into something else. Validation. Not calm validation. Not relief. But the kind that comes from someone who believes the worst thing he suspected has now been proven in public. His posture changed, just slightly. Not enough for everyone else to notice, but enough to show that the initial disbelief was reorganizing itself into confidence. He looked straight ahead now, no longer reacting like a man blindsided by error, but like a man who believed he had finally been vindicated. A low murmur passed through the room before fading again. Brian exhaled through his nose and sat back a little more firmly. "I knew something was off," he said. Anne finally turned her head slightly toward him. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to look at him. There was no panic in her expression, no collapse, no attempt to defend herself in the face of what had just been rid. That unsettled the energy in the room more than if she had cried, because Brian expected impact. He expected this result to land on her visibly. But Anne was not reacting like someone caught in a lie. She was reacting like someone waiting for the rest of the truth to arrive. Brian did not yet see that. He was already moving ahead in his own mind. He imagined the meaning of the result before the moment had even finished unfolding. All the doubt he had carried now seemed justified. Every cold silence, every note in the notebook, every private suspicion he had treated like logic. In his mind, the report had transformed all of it into reason. He looked toward Anne more directly now, not with rage, but with a harsh kind of certainty. "You see," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried enough force to make the room feel smaller. Anne held his gaze for a brief moment, then looked forward again. That response irritated him more than argument would have, because her calm refused to fit the outcome he thought he had won. The judge lowered his eyes to the file again. Brian noticed the movement, but his mind was already running ahead. For the first time in weeks, he felt steady, not emotionally steady, but structurally steady, as if the ground beneath him had returned. He had brought the process here. He had demanded proof. He had forced the issue into the open, and now the first answer placed on record appeared to support his demand. He told himself that everything after this would be simple. The truth had spoken. Now consequences would follow. He sat straighter. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the firmness of someone reclaiming control. "This is why I pushed for the test," he said, "because none of this was adding up." No one answered him. The room did not affirm him, but he did not need affirmation. Not in that moment. His own interpretation was enough. Anne's quiet presence remained unchanged. That alone should have warned him. A woman falsely exposed does not usually sit in silence with that kind of steadiness, unless she knows something the accusation has not reached yet. But Brian did not understand that. He was too focused on the first layer of the result, too focused on the version of the truth he believed he had earned. He had wanted clarity. He thought it had arrived. He had wanted proof. He believed it was now on his side. And for one dangerous moment, Brian felt something close to triumph. Not joy, not peace, but vindication. The kind that makes a person stand taller before they realize the floor beneath them is about to give way. Because what Brian did not understand yet, what no one in that room fully understood yet, was that the first result was not the whole result. It was only the doorway, and he had already stepped through it with confidence, without realizing that the next line would expose not Anne's betrayal, but his own blindness. Brian sat there with a sense of certainty settling into his posture. The first result had already shaped his conclusion. In his mind, the situation was no longer unclear. It had been confirmed, but the judge had not finished. He adjusted the document again, carefully. Brian noticed the movement this time, not with urgency, but with mild impatience, because as far as he was concerned, the important part had already been said. The judge looked down at the remaining section of the report. His expression did not change. "There is an additional note attached to this report," he said. Brian frowned slightly. "What note?" he asked. The confidence in his voice was still there, but now there was curiosity. The judge continued without reacting to the tone. "Due to inconsistencies in the sample provided," he said, "the laboratory conducted a secondary verification process." That word landed differently. Inconsistencies. Brian's expression shifted. "Inconsistencies?" he repeated. The room felt less certain now, not tense, but unsettled, because the direction of the moment had changed. The judge nodded once. "Yes." He turned to the page. Brian's posture straightened again, not out of confidence this time, but alertness, because something no longer aligned with the conclusion he had already accepted. Anne remained still, but her eyes moved slightly, not toward Brian, toward the judge, waiting. The judge continued. "Based on further analysis," he said, "the DNA sample submitted by you did not align with expected biological markers." Brian blinked. The sentence didn't land the same way the first one had. It didn't confirm anything. It interrupted. "What does that mean?" he asked. The firmness in his voice had softened, not dramatically, but enough. The judge looked directly at him. "It means," he said, "that additional findings were identified during the verification process." Brian leaned forward. "Then explain it," he said, because now he needed clarity again. The certainty he had just claimed was beginning to shift. The judge did not rush. He spoke the next words clearly. "Mr. Brian, the results indicate that you are medically unable to father a child naturally." Silence, not the kind that holds tension, the kind that removes it completely. Brian didn't move. For a moment, he didn't react at all, like his body had paused, waiting for his mind to catch up. "What?" The word came out quietly, not forceful, not controlled, just disbelief. The judge didn't repeat himself. He simply held the space for the meaning to settle. "That's not true," Brian said quickly. Too quickly. "I would know that." But even as he said it, something shifted. Not outside, inside. A memory. Something distant. A conversation he didn't fully pay attention to. A checkup he didn't follow through on. A detail he dismissed, because it didn't interfere with his life at the time. Brian shook his head. "No," he said again. But this time, it didn't sound like certainty. It sounded like resistance. Anne finally turned toward him. Her expression hadn't changed much, but there was something in her eyes now. Not anger, not satisfaction, understanding. "You didn't know," she said softly. Brian looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Anne took a slow breath. "I found out early," she said. Brian stared at her. "Found out what?" he asked. Anne's voice remained steady. "That something wasn't adding up," she said. "So I went to a doctor to make sure everything was okay." Brian didn't interrupt, because now He was listening differently, not to respond, but to understand. They asked questions, Anne continued, about timing, about history. She paused briefly. About you. Brian's expression tightened. And what did you tell them? He asked. Anne held his gaze. The truth, she said. Another pause. They suggested that you get checked too. Brian didn't respond, because that sounded familiar, uncomfortably familiar. But he had ignored it, not intentionally, just because it didn't seem urgent. Anne continued. I didn't accuse you, she said. I didn't assume anything. She took a breath. I waited. That word carried weight, because waiting requires trust, and she had given that. Brian looked down briefly, then back up. So what are you saying? He asked. Anne didn't raise her voice. I'm saying you accused me without understanding yourself first. The words landed fully, not rushed, not softened, clear and undeniable. Brian sat back slowly. For the first time since the process began, he had no immediate response, no correction, no explanation, no structure to fall back on, because everything he built his certainty on had just collapsed, not in pieces, all at once. The notes, the timelines, the assumptions, the control, all of it, and in its place was something he hadn't prepared for. Truth, not the version he expected, the version he avoided. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, because nothing he said would change what had just been revealed, and more importantly, nothing he said could undo what he had done. Anne didn't move toward him, didn't step away either. She simply remained where she was, grounded, because this moment wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about understanding what had already been lost. And Brian was finally beginning to see it, not through control, not through logic, but through consequence. The courtroom didn't react immediately. No sudden movement, no loud response, just a shift, the kind that settles slowly, but changes everything. Brian remained seated, still, not because he had regained control, but because he had lost it completely. The certainty that brought him there was gone, and in its place was something unfamiliar, not confusion, understanding. And understanding can be heavier than doubt. The judge closed the file in front of him. This case, he said calmly, is a reminder that assumptions can cause more damage than facts. His tone wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be, because the situation had already said enough. He looked at Brian. Next time, he added, seek understanding before accusation. Brian didn't respond, not out of resistance, but because there was nothing left to defend. Then the judge turned his attention to Anne. You handled this with composure, he said. Anne nodded slightly. Thank you. And just like that, the process ended, not with resolution, but with truth. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. People began to move, but for Brian and Anne, everything remained still. Brian stood up slowly, not rushed, not steady, just present. For the first time, without direction, Anne stood as well, her movements calm, measured, not because nothing had happened, but because she had already processed what mattered most. They walked out of the courtroom separately, not intentionally, but naturally. Outside, the air felt different, open, unrestricted. Anne stepped forward, taking a slow breath. For the first time in a long while, her shoulders relaxed, not because everything was fixed, but because she no longer had to defend herself. The weight she had been carrying, the doubt, the silence, the accusation, was no longer hers. Brian stepped out a few moments later. He stopped a few feet behind her, watching, not with certainty, not with control, with realization. Anne. His voice wasn't firm. It wasn't structured. It was honest. She turned, not quickly, not reluctantly, just calmly. Brian looked at her, really looked this time, without assumption, without expectation. I'm sorry, he said. No explanation, no justification, just the truth. Anne studied his face for a moment, not searching for flaws, not looking for weakness, just understanding what had changed. I believe you, she said. Brian blinked slightly, not expecting that. A small pause followed. Then, can we... He didn't finish the sentence, because he didn't know how. Anne shook her head gently. Not harsh, not emotional, just certain. Some things don't go back, Brian. Her voice was steady, not cold, but clear. She placed her hand on her stomach, a quiet, grounding gesture. I need peace now, she said. not proof. The words settled between them. Final. Brian looked down briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because for the first time, he understood what he had done. Not just the accusation, not just the court case, but the damage. He had tried to prove something about Anne, without ever questioning himself, and by the time the truth came out, it wasn't about who was right anymore. It was about what had been broken. Anne took a step back, not away from him, but forward for herself. There was no anger in her movement, no hesitation, just direction. She turned and began to walk. Brian didn't stop her, didn't call her back, because he knew this wasn't a moment that could be reversed. He stood there, still, watching her move forward, not alone, but stronger, because she hadn't lost herself trying to prove something to someone who had already decided to doubt her. And Brian was left with something he had avoided for too long. Reflection, not about the outcome, but about the process that led him there. Because sometimes the hardest lesson isn't being wrong. It's realizing you hurt someone who was telling the truth all along. And in that realization, there's no argument left to make, only understanding, and whatever comes after it. Please subscribe for more stories like this.